At dawn, as fog rolled over the farm, Edward, a hardened racist, looked out the window, his thoughts filled with anger. He had always felt superior to others, but this day marked the beginning of his downfall. In the distance, he noticed a young black girl, Layla, walking through a field. Hatred filled him, and he could not resist temptation. Gathering his thoughts, Edward decided that kidnapping Layla would give him the power he had always dreamed of. He quickly rushed out of the house, capturing her as she entered his territory. Layla, realizing what had happened, was in shock, but her fear quickly gave way to determination. She knew that her father was a powerful man in the city, and she had to do everything to get out. While Edward hid her in the barn, Layla used every opportunity to gather her thoughts and come up with an escape plan. She noticed an old axe in the corner and began to slowly creep towards it. But at that moment, Edward returned, his eyes full of rage and fear. She instantly threw the axe towards the door, creating a distraction. Layla ran out of the barn and toward the road. She saw a police cruiser drive by and raised her hands, screaming for help. The officers, noticing her panicked appearance, immediately stopped and jumped out of the car. Layla felt that salvation was near. Meanwhile, Edward, realizing that Layla had escaped, was overcome with terror. He knew he could not afford to be caught. In a panic, he returned to the house, his thoughts of hatred, which had once given him strength, now turning against him. Police, having received a report of the kidnapping, quickly organized a search. Layla, sitting in the car with the officers, told them what had happened, but her thoughts were occupied not only with fear, but also with the question of how her father would react to the situation. As the police searched for Edward, he became increasingly hopeless. It became clear to him that his racist views had led him to his ultimate downfall. Rumors began to circulate around him, and soon reports of a kidnapping began to come into town, attracting the attention of the local news. Layla, returning to the city with the police, felt that her life would never be the same. Her father, upon learning of what had happened, held a press conference full of emotion and determination. He was ready to do everything to protect his daughter and put an end to the hatred in society. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. Edward, trapped in his farm, knew that time was running out. The police surrounded him, and he no longer knew how to get out of this nightmare. What do you think Edward's fate will be? How will Layla cope with the consequences of this terrible situation? And what steps will her father take to change society? Write in the comments what is your name and where are you watching this video from. Your support is very important to us and helps us develop our channel. Together we can create even more amazing stories. Enjoy watching. As Edward realized that his world, built on hatred and prejudice, was beginning to crumble, he became more nervous and aggressive. In the barn where Layla was being held, the silence was broken only by the sound of his footsteps. He constantly checked the lock on the door, afraid that she would escape. Every second seemed like an eternity, and his anger only grew. Layla, in the confined space, tried to calm herself. She knew her father was the mayor, and his influence knew no bounds, but he couldn't know where she was. She knew she had to find a way to communicate her whereabouts. A feeling grew inside her that if she survived, she could make a difference. Edward soon made a decision. He would not just keep Layla, he would use her as a tool for his own purposes. His darkness covered him completely. He began to make plans to intimidate her, to silence her. His hatred for her only grew, not only as a person, but as a symbol of everything he despised. Meanwhile, Layla hadn't lost hope. She decided that she had to try to find a way out. Every time Edward left her alone, she would look around the room, looking for any clues or objects that could help her. At one point, she noticed that one of the floorboards had come loose. This could be her chance. The tension grew with each passing minute. Edward, feeling his plans falling apart, became increasingly unstable. He knew the police might be close, and this made him panic. A battle was unfolding in his mind. He wanted the world to remain as it was, but he knew that everything was changing. Layla, working on her escape plan, tried not to give in to fear. She knew she had to take every opportunity to break free and tell what had happened. Her mind raced with thoughts of how many people suffered from prejudice, how she herself had been a victim of Edward's hatred. Finally, one day, when Edward went outside to check if the police were approaching, Layla took advantage of the moment. She began to yank hard on the board, trying to free it. She knew that if she was going to break free, she would have to act quickly. At this time, rumors of a kidnapping began to circulate around town. People discussed how racism still permeated society. Even in their small town, Layla realized that her story was not just her struggle, but the struggle of many others who faced prejudice and violence. When Edward returned, he noticed that Layla had become more assertive and confident. This frightened him. He knew that he had to do something decisive or she would become a threat to him. He leaned toward her, and there was a threat in his voice. "You have no right to fight. You do not belong here." Layla answered him in a calm voice, "I belong to this world, and no one has the right to take that away." These words caused a storm of emotions in Edward. He did not expect that the victim he wanted to intimidate would resist. This confrontation became a turning point for both of them. How do you think this will all end? Will Layla find a way to get out and tell her story? And what consequences will Edward face for his actions? Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Your support is very important to us and helps us develop our channel. Together we can create even more exciting stories. As dawn broke and the fog slowly lifted over Edward's farm, his hatred for the world around him reached its peak. He looked out the window, full of malice and prejudice, and saw Layla, a young black girl, walking across the field. In his mind, she became a symbol of everything he hated. In that moment, he made a decision that would change their lives forever. Edward grabbed her when she was nearby. Layla was shocked when he shoved her into the car. She knew that everything she knew and everyone she loved could be lost. Edward was full of hatred, and it gave him strength. "You don't belong here," he said, looking at her with disdain. Trapped in the barn, Layla felt fear and rage warring inside her. She knew her father was a powerful man, but that couldn't help her at the moment. She searched for a way out, trying to find weak spots in the castle and the walls. Layla wasn't going to give up. Her inner voice told her that she had to fight for her freedom. Edward became more and more aggressive every day. He became enraged at every mention of racial differences, issuing threats against Layla. His words, full of contempt, wounded her in ways he had not even suspected. "You don't belong among normal people," he hissed, clenching his fists. These words did not leave her alone, and each time he said them, she felt her spirit trying to break. One day, when Edward went out, leaving Layla alone, she used the time to carefully examine the barn. She found an old tool that could be her chance to escape. Layla knew she had to tread carefully, but a fire of determination burned in her heart. She was not going to be a victim. That night, as darkness fell over the farm, Edward was furious again. He learned that people in town had begun asking questions about Layla. "You shouldn't have talked to anyone," he shouted, towering over her. His threat was clear, and Layla felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that his hatred could lead to terrible consequences. Every night when Edward was gone, Layla worked on her plan. She knew she had to be prepared for any eventuality. Her thoughts kept returning to her family, to how they would suffer if she didn't return. This desire to survive became her engine. But Edward wasn't giving up. He had become even more dangerous, and Layla knew he had connections that could help him hide his crimes. "I'll always find you," he whispered as he walked away, leaving her alone with her fears. Layla knew she had to do something before it was too late. Every day her determination grew, and she felt that the world outside the barn was no longer the same. Her suffering became a symbol of the fight against racism and hatred. Alone in the dark barn, Layla felt her fear turn to determination. Every sound outside the walls seemed like thunder, but she couldn't afford to give in. She rethought her plan. The board she'd spotted was her only chance. She decided she couldn't wait for Edward to come back in a rage. Using the tool she had found, she began working on the board, carefully lifting it so as not to attract attention. With each tug, her heart pounded faster, but hope began to rise inside her. She had to get out before Edward returned. Suddenly the barn doors creaked and Layla froze. Edward walked in, his face twisted in anger. "I told you I wouldn't let you escape," he hissed, his voice full of hatred. He came closer and Layla felt her fear grow. "I will not obey you," she shouted, trying to pull herself together. This caused an immediate reaction. Edward, surprised by her boldness, stopped. He never expected that she would be able to resist him. "Do you think you can change anything?" His eyes sparkled, and Layla realized that he had gone too far. He had become even more unpredictable, and it scared her. Meanwhile, the town began to talk. Rumors of her kidnapping spread, and soon people began to wonder where Layla had gone. Her father, the mayor, organized a search, realizing that his daughter was in danger. Tension arose in the town, and the growing hatred for Edward became more and more palpable. Layla couldn't afford to lose hope. Every night she planned her actions, trying to find ways to communicate her situation. She even found a few items that could help her, but her fear of Edward kept her on edge. Once again, when Edward left her alone, she decided this was her chance. She quickly worked with the tool, freeing the board and creating a small gap, just wide enough for her to squeeze through. Her heart pounded as she noticed the police voices coming from behind the walls. At that moment, she knew she had to act. She crawled out of the barn and crept carefully to the door, keeping her ears open, but as soon as she opened the door, Edward jumped out at her, his eyes full of hatred and rage. "You're not leaving," he screamed, grabbing her arm. Layla, in a panic, broke free and ran towards the forest. Her heart was pounding and her breath was caught in fear, but she knew she couldn't give up. As she raced through the trees, hearing Edward shouting after her, she thought about how this escape would change everything. Every move she made was full of determination, and despite her fear, she felt that it was in this fight that she could find strength. Edward, realizing that she was running away, was furious. He rushed after her, his hatred for her growing like never before. He knew that he could lose not only his victim, but also his idea of power. Layla ran, hiding behind the trees, feeling the ground beneath her feet become unstable. She knew that time was against her, and her path to freedom was strewn with danger, but a fire of struggle burned within her. She could not let Edward's hatred win. When she ran a few meters, she came across an old abandoned hut. Quickly hiding behind the door, she listened to the sounds outside. Edward was still looking for her, and every step he took made her heart skip a beat. "You can't hide from me," his voice echoed outside, and Layla realized that her life now depended on her every choice. She knew she had to use her wits to trick him and find a way to escape. She decided she wouldn't wait for him to find her. Layla began to look around the hut, looking for anything that might help her, old tools, maybe even something that would allow her to communicate with the outside. The struggle began in her mind. She was not only a victim, but also a symbol of the struggle against the hatred that had taken over the world around her. Her whole being screamed for freedom, and in that moment she realized that her suffering could be the beginning of change. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for every person's right to be free from prejudice and hatred. Layla knew there would be many more trials ahead, but her resolve only grew stronger. She was ready to fight. Layla, hiding in an abandoned hut, felt fear intertwined with determination. Every sound outside the walls made her tremble, but she understood that she had to act. Inside the hut there was semi-darkness, and she tried not to make a single unnecessary movement. As Edward continued to search the area, Layla noticed that one of the walls was paneled. She walked closer and found a crack through which a faint light was shining. Her heart pounded. Perhaps this was her connection to the world beyond. She began to gently tug at one of the panels, hoping that there was something behind it. Edward's angry cry was heard outside. "I'll find you. You can't escape me." Layla, realizing that time was running out, tried her best to rip the panel off. Her arms were numb, but she couldn't stop. Every second counted. Finally, the panel gave way, and Layla pulled it out with difficulty. Behind it was an old ventilation shaft. This was her salvation. She quickly slipped into the narrow opening, feeling the adrenaline filling her body. But at that moment, she heard footsteps. Edward was approaching. As she crawled through the shaft, every breath was a struggle. She heard Edward rip the door of the cabin off its hinges and begin searching each room. Layla, huddled in the corner of the vent, tried to remain silent. Her thoughts returned to her family and friends, and that gave her strength. Suddenly, a crackling sound broke the silence. Edward had found her tracks. "I can feel you," he screamed, and it sent a wave of fear through Layla. She knew she was more than just a victim. She was part of this terrible game, where her life was at stake. Layla continued to crawl, her thoughts veering between hope and despair. She remembered how many people were fighting against prejudice and hatred, and realized that her fight was not just her own, but the fight of many. Finally, she reached the end of the shaft and saw the light. However, at that moment, she heard Edward, who was already nearby. He tore out the ventilation hole and shouted with hatred, "You will not escape from me." Layla quickly climbed out, finding herself in a dense forest. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to burst. She ran, trying not to turn around, hearing Edward rushing after her. The forest was full of life. But Layla felt lost and alone. Every step she took her further away from him, but she knew he would not give up. His hatred became his strength. The light began to dim, and memories of growing up, of how her family always told her to persevere despite the difficulties, began to appear in Layla's mind. This inspiration became her support as she made her way through the dense undergrowth, trying not to make a sound. She finally came to a clearing where lights were flickering in the distance. It was the city. Hope filled her heart, but at that moment panic pierced her. Edward was nearby. She heard his footsteps, and her body froze with fear. Layla spotted a small ravine and quickly jumped into it. Hiding from Edward's eyes, she huddled, knowing that this was her last chance. Breathing deeply, she tried to calm herself. At that moment, her thoughts returned to her father. He was probably already looking for her, and that gave her strength. Edward stopped at the edge of the clearing, his breathing heavy and his face contorted with rage. "You can't hide forever," he screamed, looking around like a predator stalking its prey. Layla could tell the hatred raged in his eyes, and it only fueled her desire to survive. Her heart pounded as she made her decision. If she couldn't run, she had to fight. She thought about everything that had happened and decided that her life mattered not just to her, but to everyone who suffered from hatred and prejudice. She couldn't let Edward win. At that moment, Layla saw a small group of people ahead. She decided that she had to run towards them, even if it was a risk. She jumped up from her hiding place and, waving her arms, screamed, "Help! Please help!" Edward, noticing her, roared in rage and rushed after her. Layla ran, full of hope, but aware that she was running not only from Edward, but from the entire system that allowed such hatred to exist. As soon as she approached the people, she felt Edward catch up with her, but they saw him and became an obstacle in his way. Layla, losing strength, screamed, "He kidnapped me! Help!" The cries of her heart echoed in the air, and in that moment she knew, her fight was not over. She had become a voice for those suffering in the shadow of hatred. Layla knew that now that she had escaped, she had to do everything she could to make her story heard, so that no one else would fall victim to the same horror. Edward, realizing that his time was running out, rushed forward in a rage, but the people, seeing his true colors, did not retreat. They stood by her side, ready to fight. Surrounded by people, Layla finally understood, there is hope in this world, hope that requires a fight, that requires a voice, and she was ready to use hers to change everything. Edward, standing at the edge of his field, felt the rage welling up inside him. He had long since sunk into his own fears and hatreds, which poisoned his soul. When he shouted at the assembled men, his voice was like thunder, reflecting all his aggression. "Get out of here, everyone! I won't let you humiliate me!" He roared as fear began to fill the space around him. People's faces turned pale with horror, and they began to retreat like animals before a predator. Every cry, every movement only increased their panic. The crowd, once united and determined, scattered in an instant, leaving only Layla standing in place. Full of determination, she realized that at this moment, when everyone else had left, it was up to her whether they could save the situation. "Edward, don't do this!" she screamed, trying to reach his mind, but his rage was blind, and he didn't hear her words. "You don't have to be alone. We can help you," she continued, her voice confident despite the fear that gripped her heart. Edward couldn't believe he had scared the men so much. He felt his power growing as they staggered away from him. It only increased his anger and his sense of power. "Now you all know I mean it," he thundered, his words resonating in the silence that followed their flight. Layla stepped closer, realizing that he was not only an angry man, but also a wounded one. "Edward, I know you're hurting, but hatred won't solve your problems." Her words cut through his rage, and she hoped he would hear her. But Edward only laughed, and there was a hopeless rage in that laugh. "You are all cowards," he shouted, and the feeling of superiority enveloped him like a cloak. He did not want to be isolated, but his own fears locked him in a cage of hatred. Layla knew that all she could do was not give up. "You are not alone, Edward. You can change your life." Her voice sounded like a beacon of hope in this dark world. As if her words had caused Edward to freeze for a moment, a glimmer of doubt flashing in his eyes. He realized that by scaring people away, he himself was left alone with his hatred. Layla continued speaking, her confidence growing stronger. "We can all change, Edward. But to do so, we must overcome our fear." Her words were sincere, and she tried to reach his heart. At that moment, Edward felt his hatred begin to fade, and his anger became an unbearable burden. He stood on the edge of the abyss, realizing that his actions had led him to loneliness. Layla looked at him with hope, and in that look, he saw an opportunity to change his fate. He slowly realized that he could choose another path. This was the defining moment, and perhaps he could overcome his inner demons to find peace and understanding. Edward stood there, filled with rage, his hatred for those around him only growing more intense. He felt his own demons, locked inside, being released, and it gave him confidence that he could control the situation. Layla, alone in a terrified crowd, knew she had to act. "Edward, this hatred will not make you stronger," she shouted, trying to get his attention. But instead he only growled, his anger growing, and he took a step towards her. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he growled, madness blazing in his eyes. Edward moved forward like a wild animal, and at that moment Layla felt fear squeeze her heart. She knew she had to find a way to stop him, but his aggression filled the space, and every move he made suggested he was ready for anything. "I won't let you do this," she screamed, but her voice shook with fear. Edward walked toward her, and with each step Layla felt her strength draining away. She looked around, and seeing that the people, frightened by his rage, had already left, she realized that she was alone. Determination boiled inside her. She had to resist. "I will not run away from you," she said, and her voice became firm. Edward froze for a moment, surprised by her courage. But the hatred he harbored made him furious again. "You're just one of them. You have no right to be here," he screamed, and his words were like poisonous arrows piercing her heart. Edward rushed forward, and Layla, full of determination, ran towards the forest. She knew it wasn't just a physical fight, but a fight for her life, for her dignity. Edward, unwilling to let her go, was chasing her with a frantic fury. Her every move was full of desperation, but she knew she had to hold on. Layla moved through the bushes, trying to remain unnoticed, but Edward kept up. He knew his land, and every time she thought she could escape, he was there again, like a shadow following her. "You can't escape me," he shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness of the forest. Layla felt fear filling her, but deep inside, a spark of hope was igniting. She remembered how important this fight was, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever experienced hatred and prejudice. "I won't let you win," she shouted, and it gave her strength. Ahead, she saw a small clearing. This could be her chance. Layla, gathering all her strength, rushed there, hoping to find shelter. But Edward did not retreat, his rage only grew. He was ready to do everything to catch her. The tension grew with each passing second. Layla knew that now everything depended only on her. She had to use all her courage to stop this hatred. Layla ran out into the clearing, and chaos unfolded around her. The wind stirred the grass, and she felt its freshness giving her strength. But behind her she heard the sound of footsteps. Edward was getting closer. She glanced back and saw him bursting out of the undergrowth, his face twisted in rage. "You can't outrun me," he screamed, and the scream echoed in her heart like a warning. She quickly looked around, looking for a place to hide. At the edge of the clearing stood an old tree with wide branches. Layla ran towards it, hoping to find shelter behind its trunk. She knew she had to use every second to think about her next move. Holding her breath, she leaned against the tree, listening to the approaching footsteps. Edward stepped into the clearing, his angry gaze darting around, searching for her. "You think you can hide? I'll find you," he shouted, waving his arms as if to scare her even more. His rage sparkled in the air, and Layla felt a chill of fear run through her. But a spark of determination ignited inside her. She remembered all the people who had suffered from hatred and prejudice, and she realized that this fight was important not only for her, but for many others. She had to show Edward that his hatred would not change anything. Layla began to move carefully around the tree, trying not to make a sound. She knew he needed time to calm down, and that she had a chance. Suddenly she saw him stop, listening, and her heart began to beat faster. Come out, coward. I know you're here." His voice was angry and menacing. Edward turned and began searching the clearing, his eyes searching for her like a predator stalking its prey. Layla realized she couldn't just hide. She had to talk to him, try to reach his heart. "Edward, listen to me," she called out, stepping out from behind the tree. His eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of surprise in them. "What are you trying to tell me?" His voice was no longer so confident. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You don't belong here." "I belong here just as much as you do," she replied, her voice full of confidence. "You think your hatred makes you stronger? It only destroys you." Edward froze, his face changing. A real battle was breaking out inside him. Layla saw his anger begin to fade, but in its place remained hatred. He didn't know how to respond. "I lost everything because of you," he finally blurted out, but his voice was less confident. Layla knew this revelation was important. "You haven't lost everything, you just don't see that there are people around you who are ready to help." Her words were sincere. Edward hesitantly took a step towards her. Layla knew that this moment could be decisive. "You can change your life, but to do that, you need to understand that hatred only deepens suffering." There was tension between them, and perhaps this was the only chance Edward would get to look at himself from the outside. His eyes filled with tears, and he froze, as if fighting a storm inside. Layla continued to look at him, hoping that he would understand that all was not lost. There was a fire burning inside them, a fire of hope and understanding that could unite them against hatred. Edward froze in place, his anger beginning to dissipate, but the shadow of hatred still lingered in his eyes. Layla felt the tension between them growing. She knew this was a crucial moment, and she had to act while he had a chance to hear her. "You are not alone, Edward," she repeated, taking a step closer. "I understand that you are suffering, but hatred will not solve your problems. It will only lead to more grief." Edward looked at her as if he had just woken up, and his expression became less aggressive. "You don't know what I've been through. You haven't seen me lose everything." His voice was weak, and Layla noticed that he was starting to open up. "You're right, I don't know everything you've been through," she agreed, trying to sound calm, "but I know that many people suffer because of hatred. We can change that if we start with ourselves. You have a chance." At that moment, Layla noticed Edward hesitate. His eyes were shining with suppressed emotions. Layla knew that her words could be the spark that would ignite the fire of change in his soul. But suddenly there was a noise from the trees. Someone was approaching. Edward tensed again, and Layla felt fear creeping up on her. "Edward, we have to talk," she shouted, not wanting anyone to interrupt this important moment. He looked back, and the anger in his eyes flared again. "Who is it? Who else has come to bother me?" he exclaimed, his voice filled with rage. Layla realized that he might return to his old aggression. "It could be someone who wants to stop you. You have to remember that you are the one who controls your reaction," she shouted, trying to bring him back to his senses. The noise was getting closer and Layla couldn't wait any longer. She took a step forward, trying to get between Edward and whoever was approaching. "Edward, if you really want to change your life, show them that you're not the same as you were before." Edward, feeling her support, froze for a moment, but then fear flashed in his eyes again, and he took a step back, as if wanting to escape the truth. "I don't know how." His voice broke. Layla saw that he was fighting with himself. Her heart beat faster. "You can do it, Edward, you can do it," she said, the confidence in her voice like a sound wave that should have penetrated his defenses. But the noise grew louder, and several men emerged from the trees, eyeing them warily. Layla felt the atmosphere change. "Edward, we have to be careful," she shouted. The men, seeing the situation, began to approach. "Edward, what's going on?" one of them asked, his voice full of confusion. Edward, back to his old self, screamed, "Get out, you don't understand." He was filled with anger again, and Layla felt the tension begin to rise again. "No, Edward, don't," she screamed, but he was already growing more furious, turning back into the man she was trying to stop. The men exchanged puzzled glances, and the situation could escalate into violence at any moment. Layla knew she had to do something to prevent it. "I won't let you ruin everything," she screamed, stepping between Edward and his potential opponents. Her voice was loud and confident. She couldn't let hatred take over again. "Edward, look at me. This is your chance to change everything," she said, and her words hung in the air like a last hope. But Edward didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were full of fury, and he was preparing for another attack. Layla felt the tension reaching its limit, and everything depended on his choice. Layla stood in the clearing, her heart pounding as Edward retreated once more into the dark world of his fears and hatreds. The smell of damp earth and freshly cut grass hung around them, but there was still tension in the air. The men who had emerged from the forest stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with confusion and wariness. Each of them seemed to sense danger in the air. "Edward, calm down," Layla screamed, trying to break through his anger. She took a step forward, putting herself between him and the new arrivals. She sounded brave, but deep down she was afraid that he would revert to his old instincts. "You don't understand who she is," Edward said with hatred towards the men, his face contorted as if he was ready to fight. "She just came here to make fun of me, like everyone else." Layla felt his words pierce her heart. She knew Edward was lost in his hatred and fears, and that was blinding him to reality. "Edward, I am not your enemy," she said, trying to put as much sincerity into her words as she could. "I am here to help you." The men exchanged wary glances, each of them seeing Edward escalate the situation. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, stepped closer and said, "Edward, we just want to understand what's going on. Please calm down and talk to us." Edward didn't seem to be listening. He was slowly raising his hands, as if preparing to attack. Layla felt panic rising in her chest. She knew that if this moment got out of control, things could end terribly. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything." His voice was on the verge of breaking, and Layla saw his eyes fill with tears. "Everything I had was taken away because of people like her." He pointed at Layla, and there was not only anger in his eyes, but also a deep wound. Layla didn't know what to say, but she knew her words had to be measured. "It's not my fault what happened to you, but hatred only deepens the suffering. Edward, we can all suffer, but together we can heal." Edward froze, his breathing heavy. A battle was raging inside him, between hatred and hope. Layla took another step forward, feeling her fear fading. "You have a choice now, Edward. You can continue to run into the dark world you created, or you can try to take a step toward understanding and forgiveness. This is not just for you. It is important for all of us." Layla's words sounded like a spell, and there was silence all around. The men behind her listened attentively, and it gave her strength. They saw that Layla really wanted to help, and it showed in her eyes. Edward swayed, as if under the influence of an invisible force. His expression changed, and Layla noticed how the struggle inside him became more and more obvious. He suddenly lowered his head, and in that moment she saw how depressed he was. "I don't know how to stop this," he finally said, his voice quiet and full of despair. "It starts with a simple step. Accept that hatred won't solve your problems and reach out to those who are willing to support you," Layla said, her heart filling with hope. But at that moment, one of the men standing to the side couldn't take it anymore and said, "Edward, you can't go on like this. We're not here to fight, we're here to help. You know there are people in our community who can support you." Edward's head snapped up, his anger flaring up again as he saw the reaction of his acquaintances. He rushed towards them, as if seeking confirmation of his hatred. Layla realized that he might now go back into the darkness, and her heart sank with fear. "Edward, think," she cried. "These people are not your enemies. They can help you. We can change everything together." But he had already turned to them, and Layla knew that the situation was becoming dangerous again. In her soul there was a certainty that this struggle for understanding was only just beginning, and she was ready to fight to bring the truth to him. Layla stood in the clearing, her nerves taut as the strings of a taut guitar. Edward, filled with rage and despair, was on the verge of exploding. The men around them exchanged worried glances, and Layla knew that time was running out. Every moment could be decisive. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of scarlet and orange, but the atmosphere around them remained tense and cold. The leaves rustled in the light breeze, as if whispering warnings of the coming conflict. Layla felt her heart pounding in her chest, and fear welling up inside, but she could not allow herself to give in. Edward, once again defending his hatred, shouted, "You all don't understand what I'm going through. They took everything from me, and now you want me to forgive?" His voice shook the air, and Layla knew that if she couldn't get through to him now, things could end badly. "Edward, I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking you to understand that you're not alone," she shouted, her voice loud and confident. Every time she said those words, her confidence grew, like a bull charging in the arena. But Edward wasn't listening. He turned back to the men, and there was madness in his eyes. Layla knew she had to do something. The urge to help flared up inside her, but at the same time, the awareness grew that she was standing on the edge of an abyss. "Edward, listen, this isn't just your fight," she cried, moving closer to him. "Together, we can overcome this hatred. Together, we can restore what we've lost." Edward glared at her. "You don't know what it's like to lose family. You don't understand how I feel," he blurted out, and there was not only anger in his voice, but also deep sadness. Layla took a step closer, her heart fluttering with fear, but she knew she had to continue. "Yes, I don't know what it is, but I know that such hatred only destroys. It consumes you, and you can lose yourself forever." Edward froze for a moment, a glimmer of doubt in his eyes, but then he looked away again, as if trying to escape the truth. At that moment, one of the men standing behind him slowly stepped forward. "Edward, this is hard for all of us, but if we don't come together, we'll only make it worse," he said, his voice full of sympathy. Edward exploded again. "Sympathy won't help me get back what I've lost." Layla felt her patience wearing thin. Every step she took in this conflict was a test, but she knew she had to keep going. She had to find a way to keep Edward from closing in on himself. Suddenly, a sound came from the depths of the forest. It was the hum of a car. Layla turned around, and her heart began to beat faster. "Someone is coming," she shouted. Edward, noticing the approaching light, panicked again and withdrew into himself, his face distorted with fear. "Edward, we have to stay together," she said, and her voice sounded like she was pulling him towards her from the depths of his inner demons. But he didn't seem to hear her anymore. Edward turned his attention back to the men standing nearby, and Layla realized that if they didn't act quickly, this could end in a fight. I can't go back to who I was before," Edward cried out, and there was deep pain in his voice. Layla saw how he hesitated, and she knew that it was important to talk to him about his fears now. "You don't have to go back to who you were. You can create something new. You can become who you want to be if you just open yourself to it." Her words rang with such sincerity that they seemed to be able to break the atmosphere of hatred surrounding them. But suddenly the car stopped and several people got out and witnessed the conflict. Layla noticed their glances slid over her and Edward, and her heart sank. She felt even more vulnerable in this situation. "What's going on here?" one of the men asked, his voice loud and authoritative. Layla knew this was going to be another test for her and Edward. They were under surveillance now, and she knew she had to act. "There's nothing going on here," she shouted, trying to take control of the situation, but her voice was unsure, and fear was starting to rear its head again. She knew that if Edward didn't calm down, things could get out of hand. "Edward, listen to me. I'm here for you," she said, trying to reach his heart. But he froze again, and Layla realized that now everything depended on him. All she could do was hope that he would make the right choice. The situation was getting tense. Layla was on the verge of despair when a tall man with long hair and a serious expression stepped out of the car. His presence immediately attracted attention, and he stepped forward as if he sensed that something was wrong. "My name is Mark. I'm a local social worker," he introduced himself to Edward. His voice was calm and confident, which in itself created an atmosphere different from the tension that reigned around him. Layla noticed how he looked at Edward intently, trying to establish contact. "What's going on here?" Mark asked, his gaze moving from Layla to Edward. "Why are you so angry?" Edward clenched his fists, and his face filled with anger again. "I don't have to explain anything. You all just don't understand what I've been through." His voice sounded threatening, but Layla noticed that he was beginning to waver, as if under the pressure of someone else's gaze. Mark, without looking away, stepped closer. "I really don't know what you're going through, Edward, but I'm here to help. You're not alone, and there are people who are ready to support you. But for that, you need to open up and talk about your feelings." Layla felt hope return to her. She saw Mark trying to create an atmosphere of trust, and it gave her the strength to continue. "Edward, listen to him. He really wants to help," she said, trying to remain calm. But Edward seemed to be sinking back into his own world of anger. You all just want to talk, but I want justice. I want everyone to know that I'm suffering," he screamed, the fires of rage blazing in his eyes again. Layla took a step towards him, but at that moment one of the men standing behind started to move towards Edward. "Edward, you shouldn't react like that. It won't lead to anything good," he said, but this only made Edward even more angry. "Get away from me. I will not listen to anyone who does not know what loss is," he shouted, and his voice rolled through the forest like thunder. Layla felt her heart stop with fear. She knew that this conflict could escalate into something terrible. Mark, remaining calm, continued to try to reach Edward. "I understand that you feel alone, and that's normal, but you don't have to stay that way. There is a way out of this cycle, and I'm here to help you find it," he said, his voice full of understanding. But Edward just shook his head. Layla could see the struggle going on inside him, and she realized that this wasn't just a conversation, it was a process in which he had to make a choice on his own. Suddenly, as if in response to their discussion, a loud cracking sound came from the forest. Layla turned around, and her heart sank again. Another person jumped up from behind the trees. It was a young woman with loose hair and a desperate expression on her face. She ran towards them, as if looking for salvation. "Help!" she screamed, her voice full of fear. "I'm being followed." Layla instantly realized that the situation had become even more complicated. Edward, forgetting his fears and anger, froze in place, and the men stood at the ready to respond to the emergence of a new threat. "Who's behind you?" one of the men shouted, and the tension in the air increased again. Layla felt her adrenaline pumping. This was a new test for them all. "I don't know. They were behind us," the woman replied, her eyes full of fear. Layla, remembering her own experiences, felt the need to help. "You're safe. We're here," she shouted, trying to calm the newcomer. Mark, wasting no time, approached the woman. "Who's stalking you? Can you tell me? It's important." His voice was soft but insistent. "These are people from the next town over. They're looking for me because I spoke at a meeting about racism. I just wanted to be heard and they're after me." Her voice shook and Layla felt her heart break with sympathy. Edward, still stunned, looked at the new girl, and Layla noticed his expression change. Perhaps he saw his own worries reflected in her fear. "You are not alone. We are all together and we can stop this," Layla said, addressing both the woman and Edward. "We can all fight against hate." At that moment, the atmosphere changed. Edward, realizing that they were all in the same boat now, began to waver. He looked at Layla and back at the new woman, his heart filling with realization. This was the moment when hatred could give way to understanding. But outside, the sound of approaching footsteps could be heard. Layla knew that time was running out. They had to work together before hatred and fear consumed them again. Layla stood in the middle of the chaos, her thoughts scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. The new girl she had just met was demanding help with a scared expression, and Edward was still on the verge of exploding. At that moment, her heart sank with sudden anxiety. She remembered her father. "My father is back in town," she whispered, as if to herself. The thought flashed through her mind that he might already be looking for her. Her father had always been strict and demanding, and her disappearance could cause a storm she did not want to see. Her fear sharpened, and her vision darkened. "What did you say?" Mark asked, catching her anxious tone. "My father. He's back. He'll be looking for me," Layla said, her voice shaking with emotion. She knew that with his return, things would get even more complicated. He was a powerful man in town and he wouldn't tolerate her getting into trouble. "You need to be careful, Layla," the new girl said, her voice full of concern. "I've heard how he's treated other people. He can be dangerous when it comes to his family." Edward, still under the pressure of his own emotions, looked at Layla. "Your father is the one who persecutes people for their views?" His voice sounded wary. Layla nodded, feeling her fear grow. "Yes, he doesn't accept dissenters. If he finds out I'm here." Suddenly, there was a noise in the bushes and everyone turned. Layla froze, her heart beating faster. Another man emerged from the trees, tall, with his hair tied in a ponytail. He looked tired, but his eyes were lit with determination. It was Daniel, an old friend of hers who knew about her fight against racism in their community. "Layla, I've been looking for you," he cried, his voice filled with alarm. "You shouldn't have come here alone. I heard your father was coming back. And, Daniel, I need your help." Layla interrupted, and she felt hope flare up inside her. She knew that with Daniel by her side, they could handle any challenge. I know he can be cruel, but we can gather people to protect ourselves. I've heard of others who have suffered from his actions. We need to join forces, Daniel said, his voice full of determination. But how do we do this? Mark asked, joining the discussion. He felt they all needed to act quickly. We need a safe place to gather and come up with a plan. Layla, feeling the tension growing, replied, my home. If my father comes back, that's where he'll go first. We can use it as a hideout, and maybe he won't look for me right away. It's risky, but we have no choice, Daniel said. If we work together, we can prepare for his return and create a safe space for everyone. Layla, are you sure? Edward asked, his voice softening. He still seemed to be struggling with his own demons, but there was understanding in his eyes. I can't let your father hurt you or anyone else. I want to help. Layla felt her heart fill with gratitude. People gathered around her, ready to fight for truth and justice. It was something new, a sense of strength and unity. Yes, together we can do it. Let's do it quickly, she shouted, and they rushed toward her house. There was tension in the air as they ran, but Layla felt hope rising again. They were ready to fight for their ideals and for those who suffered from hatred. She knew there would be trials ahead, but now she had support, and that gave her strength. As soon as they reached her house, Layla felt the fear return. She knew that everything could change in an instant. She couldn't forget who her father was. With every step towards the door, her heart beat faster. They entered the house, and as they closed the door behind them, Layla knew that everything now depended on them. It was quiet inside, and she saw the photographs on the walls, her smiling with her father, her joyful moments that now seemed distant and alien. It reminded her that they were fighting not only for themselves, but for a future free of fear and hatred. What next? Daniel asked, his voice ringing in the silence. Layla took a deep breath. We need to gather people so they know we're not alone. We can create a support network, and we need to be prepared for him to come at any moment. They began to discuss how to contact the others and arrange a meeting. Layla felt her resolve growing stronger with each passing moment, but at the same time, her thoughts still returned to her father. She knew that despite all her efforts, she would have to face him, and this was the greatest test of her life. Her decision was made. They had to act, and she was ready to fight for her friends and for those who suffered from racism and hatred. In that moment, surrounded by support, Layla realized that she was not alone. Layla sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts wandering between her childhood memories and what lay ahead. Hope and fear warred within her. In that moment, as she looked at her friends, she was overcome by the feeling that they all needed each other more than ever. Her father, Gerald, was an influential figure in the town. Not only was he a successful businessman, the owner of several large enterprises, but he was also a member of the local council. His ambitions and connections allowed him to occupy high positions, but with this came shadows. He always held conservative views and was not afraid to openly express his biases. His words and actions often shocked people, and with each passing year the hatred only grew. Layla remembered being proud of her father as a child. His achievements inspired her, but as she grew older, she realized how different his views were from her own. She often heard him insist on the importance of traditional values, sometimes disregarding the feelings and opinions of others. This became increasingly unacceptable, and that is why she chose the path of activism. What do you think he'll do when he finds out I'm here? Layla said, breaking the silence that had fallen in the room. He'll call people to support him, Daniel replied. He may try to intimidate us, but now that we have each other's support, we can stand up to him. This isn't just a fight against him, this is a fight against everything he represents, Layla said, feeling anger rise in her chest. He needs to understand that we're not afraid. In the midst of this determination, they were joined by several others who had learned of the situation, each of them united by the same goal, to rid themselves of the fear and hatred that still ate away at their society. Mark, trying to ease the tension, suggested, we can have a meeting to discuss plans. We need to figure out who can help and how best to organize our defense. This will help us not only unite, but also create strategies against any possible attacks. Layla nodded. Yes, but we need to be careful. If my father finds out that I'm here and that we're going to confront him, he'll stop at nothing. He can use his connections and influence people to make them turn against us. At this point, a new girl named Sarah decided to intervene. I heard that he doesn't just influence politics. He also supports local groups that oppose any changes. This could be dangerous for all of us. We need to know what he's planning, Daniel said, his voice firm. If we have information about his actions, we can prepare. Layla took a deep breath, her thoughts filled with worry. I know he's planning some kind of event to support his policies. Maybe we should try to infiltrate his meeting, she suggested. It's risky, Mark said, but if we can find out what his plans are, that could be the deciding factor. We can warn people of his intentions in advance. Sarah looked at Layla, her eyes full of determination. I'm willing to go with you. If he sees us, it might alert him and he won't know what we're really doing. Layla felt a spark of hope light up inside her. She knew she now had a team ready to fight. Okay, then let's make a plan. We need to know what he's saying and how we can use it against him. At that moment, a new group of activists approached them, including people who had suffered from bias in the past. Layla knew that they weren't just there for themselves, they were there for those who couldn't fight. That gave her strength. Each of them brought something different to the overall idea. Some wanted to tell their stories. Others wanted to create a campaign against racism. Layla felt that they could make a difference if they came together. The next day, they began preparing for the first step, infiltrating a social gathering organized by her father. Layla and Sarah had researched the event, and they knew they had to be careful not to attract attention. On the day of the meeting, Layla felt her heart pounding. She knew this would be her first confrontation with her father since she had strayed from his ideals. This wasn't just a test for her, it was a test for everything she stood for. As soon as they entered the hall, Layla noticed many familiar faces, people she had seen at events supporting her father. Her gaze met Gerald's, and in that moment she felt their gazes pierce each other. You came, he said, a hint in his voice as his gaze slid over her clothes and who she was with. Layla knew this was only the beginning of their confrontation. Her heart began to beat faster, and she knew this moment would determine everything. She had to be prepared for what was coming next. Layla stood in the hall, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. Her father, Gerald, had a look of prejudice and severity in his eyes, and she knew that this moment could be decisive not only for her, but for everyone who had been subjected to his hatred. He had always put himself above others, and now she had to confront that. Gerald, noticing her, immediately addressed the congregation. I see that my daughter has chosen to support her friends instead of being with her family, he said, his voice laced with mockery. That's the choice she made. I hope she understands the consequences of her actions. Layla felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There were whispers in the room, and she realized that all eyes were on her. She quickly clenched her fists, trying to remain calm. Her thoughts went back to those who had come with her. Sarah and Daniel. They were waiting to hear her. Dad, I came to speak up for what's important, she replied, her voice firm. We can't sit in the shadows and let hate rule our city. We have to come together to fight prejudice and racism. Gerald frowned, his face becoming even more tense. To join forces with those who do not understand true values, you should know that some things will not change. You are risking your future, Layla. The meeting, which had once seemed formal, became tense. Layla noticed how some people began to whisper and glance at each other. She knew she had the power to change perceptions, but it took courage. Dad, I know you care about me, but I can no longer accept silence when injustice happens around me, she continued, trying to speak confidently. Our community suffers from stereotypes and prejudice, and I want to be part of the change. Change? How are you going to do that, Layla? His voice was sharp, but there was concern in it. You think you can change the minds of people who have already chosen their side? Layla felt her inner fire blazing. She couldn't let her father stop her. I believe that if we can open others' eyes, if we can share our stories, we can change this hatred into understanding, she said, raising her head. There was silence in the room. The people who had once supported Gerald were now beginning to reflect. Layla saw some of them whispering to each other. This was what she wanted, to provoke a discussion, to provoke a reaction. Layla, you're still my daughter, Gerald finally said, his voice softer but still threatening. You need to know that if you continue down this path, you'll lose your friends. I can't support what you're doing. Layla felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she couldn't allow herself to give in. I won't lose those who believe in justice, she cried, I will fight for what is right, even if it means I have to leave you." The phrase hung in the air, and the tension in the room increased. Layla knew that her words had weight, and that her father could not simply ignore her now. Gerald crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold. "Do you really think this decision will be easy? You will face the consequences. Layla, don't forget what I can do to your career, to your friends." Layla, feeling the pressure mounting, looked at her allies. Their support was important to her, and she knew she was not alone. "I am willing to fight. I am willing to accept the consequences of my actions if it means change," she said, her voice firm. "You all must understand that you will be up against a powerful force," Gerald said to everyone, "and if you want to stand next to my daughter, you will have to face the consequences." The meeting came to an end, and Layla knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but this was only the beginning. She knew that despite her father's threats, she had the strength and support to continue the fight. They had to join forces and be ready for the challenges that lay ahead. As Layla left the room, she felt she had taken the first step toward change. Her paternal authority was no longer an obstacle, but a source of motivation. With every action, with every word, she was getting closer to her goal of creating a society where everyone would be equal. She didn't know yet how difficult it would be, but one thing was clear: she was ready to fight. "Sorry for the confusion. Let's continue with the correct name." Layla left the meeting knowing that her father, Gerald, would use all his connections to suppress her efforts, but her thoughts kept returning to Edward, the farmer who had kidnapped her. This man was not only a manifestation of racism, but also a reflection of a larger problem in society. Edward was known in the area for his aggressive views and his ability to manipulate people. His reputation had taken on a darker tone, and he was not shy about openly expressing his prejudices. Layla knew that his hatred for people different from him could become a danger to anyone who opposed him. The day after the meeting, Layla and her friends decided to organize a meeting with local activists to discuss how to confront not only her father, but Edward as well. It was important to her that they knew about his threats and how his actions could impact the community. As they gathered at the cafe, Layla noticed the atmosphere was tense. Participants discussed recent events involving Edward, sharing their own stories of how his bias had affected their lives. "Edward has become even more aggressive," said one of the interlocutors, a young man named Jason. "He has organized his supporters and openly threatens anyone who opposes him." Layla nodded, feeling her heart beat faster. "We have to stop him. If he continues to spread hatred, it could lead to violence. We need to unite to show that we are not afraid." The group began to discuss how to use their voices to make a change. Layla knew they had to create a safety net to help people escape Edward's influence. But she also knew that Edward would not sit idly by. He would most likely respond to their actions with aggression, and this worried her. Meanwhile, Edward, realizing that Layla and her friends were beginning to organize, began gathering his followers and planning how to suppress these rebellions. He had always been able to manipulate people, convincing them that his views were the only correct ones. "We have to show them who's boss," he said at one of his meetings, his voice full of hatred. "These people are trying to destroy our way of life, and we can't let that happen." Edward stoked fear among his followers, assuring them that they were under threat. He proposed creating a security group to monitor the movements of Layla and her friends. This was only the beginning of his plan. Layla felt the situation was becoming increasingly tense. She knew that Edward would do anything to maintain power. This forced her and her team to act faster. They needed to gather information about his actions and plan how to counter his aggression. Every day more and more people started to support Layla. She felt that the fight for justice was not only her personal fight, but also a common cause of all who dreamed of change. With each new ally, her confidence only grew. Layla knew there would be hardships ahead, but her resolve only grew stronger. She couldn't afford to give up, especially with dangerous opponents like Edward looming on the horizon. Their fight was just beginning, and she was ready to fight for truth and justice, no matter what the challenges that awaited them. Layla stood at the window of her room, looking out at the sunset, when her phone rang. It was Daniel. "We've gathered information on Edward, and I think it's time to act. We have evidence of his threats and violence. We need to get the police involved," he said with determination. Layla felt her heart skip a beat. This was a step she had been waiting for, but she wasn't sure how her father would react. Still, she knew it was a necessary step. She replied to Daniel, Okay, let's arrange a meeting with the police. I'll talk to Dad, he can help with that. As Layla sat down to dinner with Gerald, her heart was pounding. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Daddy, I have something important to discuss, she began, trying to sound calm. Gerald raised his eyebrows. Something about Edward? Layla nodded. We have collected evidence of his threats. I want to involve the police so that they arrest him. Her father froze for a moment. In his eyes, Layla saw the struggle between his usual view of the world and what he understood about his daughter. Are you sure this is the right move? It could have serious consequences, he said, his voice cautious. I'm sure, Dad. If we don't do anything, he'll continue to threaten people and stir up hatred, Layla replied, her resolve only growing stronger. Finally, Gerald agreed to help. Okay, I'll talk to the chief of police. If you have evidence, it might work, he said, his voice serious. The next day, they met with a police officer who listened to Layla and Gerald. Layla, feeling supported by her father, laid out all the details she and her friends had gathered. The police officer was impressed. If you have concrete evidence, we can organize an operation, he said. We must be careful, Gerald noted. Edward could become dangerous if he realized we were about to act. Layla nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They began planning the operation to arrest Edward. The police prepared all the necessary measures, and Layla felt the excitement growing. When the day of the operation arrived, Layla couldn't sit still. She arrived with the police, her heart pounding with anticipation. She knew this could change everything, for her and for the entire community. As they approached Edward's farm, Layla saw him working in the fields, looking calm and confident, unaware of the group of people gathering around him, ready for action. The police got out of their cars, and Layla felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. It was all too real. She had expected Edward to react aggressively to them, and that didn't make her feel any more confident. The most important thing now is safety, said one of the police officers. If everything goes according to plan, we should be able to detain him without any problems. Layla nodded, her thoughts filled with worries for her friends and family. She knew there were big risks involved. Suddenly, she saw Edward turn around and notice them. His eyes flared with anger as he realized what was happening. What are you doing here? He shouted, his voice filled with rage. The police quickly surrounded him, and Layla felt a surge of determination wash over her. She stepped forward, ready to tell him that she was no longer afraid. This is the end. Edward, we will not allow you to threaten people anymore, she cried, her voice confident and sharp. Edward, unable to contain his anger, tried to break free, but the police had already handcuffed him. Layla watched, feeling her heart fill with hope. This was a step towards justice, and she knew there was still a lot of fighting ahead. But now, in this moment, she knew they had taken an important step toward change, and while her relationship with her father might have been complicated, today they stood together against hatred and injustice. As Edward was dragged into the police car, Layla felt the tension begin to melt away. She knew this was only the first step in a long fight, but now she felt a sense of victory. The police began filling out paperwork and asking questions, recording every detail, and Layla knew her voice had been heard. You're doing great, Layla, Gerald said, standing next to her. His voice was full of pride, something she hadn't expected. She glanced at her father and saw that his face had softened, and his eyes were filled with understanding. Perhaps he was beginning to realize how important this fight was for his daughter and for the entire town. As the police processed the arrest, Layla stepped aside to collect her thoughts. Her heart was still pounding, and she couldn't help but feel nervous. Edward was a symbol of hate, and now that he was under arrest, they had a chance to change the situation in the county. But she knew that with Edward's arrest, things were just beginning. Her thoughts turned to his supporters, who might try to respond by upholding their ideals of hatred. There were many people in their village who supported Edward, and she knew that they weren't going to give up so easily. Meanwhile, in the police car, Edward, seeing Layla, shouted, "You can't change anything. Girl, this is just the beginning." A cold feeling came over her. Edward could really cause trouble if his followers decided to take revenge. Layla knew they had to prepare for the possible reaction. She turned to the police officer who was overseeing the operation. We need to beef up security in the area. Edward is not alone, he has followers and they may try to mount a response," she said. The policeman nodded, taking her words seriously. "We are already prepared for this. We have information about his supporters, and we will monitor the situation," he answered confidently. Returning to Gerald, Layla said, "Dad, we need to warn people that Edward has been arrested. Perhaps we should organize a meeting with the neighbors so they know we are not alone. It's time to unite." Gerald nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. This is an important step. People need to know they can trust their votes and actions." The next day, Layla and Gerald organized a meeting at the local center. They invited everyone who was willing to support change in the community. Layla prepared a speech in which she talked about what was happening and the importance of uniting against hate. People began to arrive and the hall gradually filled up. Layla felt her heart fill with hope. In the eyes of her neighbors she saw the same determination that burned in her soul. When it was her turn to speak, she went up on stage and spoke. "We are not here to be afraid, but to unite. Edward was a symbol of hate, but his arrest is only the beginning. We must create a society where everyone feels safe and respected." The room filled with applause. Layla felt her words resonate with people. They were ready to act. Outside of this gathering, however, Edward had already begun to gather his followers. Even though he was in custody, his influence was still strong. Layla knew they had to be prepared for a backlash, and she was. In the following days, she worked with activists to create a plan to protect their community. They began holding training sessions on how to deal with hate and racism, and engaging people in discussions. But when she went out on the streets, sometimes it felt like Edward, even in captivity, still controlled part of the city. The tension was mounting, and she knew they would soon be tested. Every step they took brought them closer to the moment when Edward might return for revenge. Layla was ready for this. She knew that with the support of her community and their belief in the cause, they could overcome any obstacle. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to give up. A meeting at a local center became a starting point for Layla and her friends. They decided that they should not just respond to threats, but actively promote ideas of equality and justice in their community. In the following weeks, Layla and her team organized several events aimed at raising awareness about racial issues. They held workshops on the importance of equality, created a platform for sharing experiences, and made public statements about the importance of uniting against hate. One day, during an event, Layla noticed how many people were coming, including those who had not previously shown interest in these issues. They discussed their stories, shared their experiences, and supported each other. Layla felt that they were creating something important, a space where everyone could be heard. However, during this time, Edward, even while in prison, continued to exert influence over his supporters. He used his network to incite hatred and spread false rumors about Layla and her team. Posters with threats and racist comments appeared and were plastered all over the county. Layla knew they were being targeted. One night, as Layla was returning home, she noticed a group of people standing at her front door. They were young men known for their devotion to Edward. They looked at her with hatred in their eyes. Layla's heart began to beat faster, but she tried to remain calm. "What are you doing here, Layla?" one of them said, his voice full of menace. "Do you think you can just change everything around you?" Layla looked at them, feeling her resolve grow stronger. "I fight for justice. I'm not afraid of you," she replied, her voice confident. These words only fueled the hatred. "Do you know what will happen if we catch you?" said another. At that moment, Layla realized that they had to find a way to protect themselves and their friends. The next day, she met with her team to discuss how they could improve safety. They decided to create a mutual aid group, people willing to protect each other if threatened. Layla also began working with the police to increase patrols in their area. At the same time, she continued her work to educate the community. At one event, Layla invited a local activist who was well known for his efforts to combat racism. He shared his story and offered practical advice on how to resist hatred and violence. People began to unite, supporting each other. Layla noticed how many who had previously been afraid to express their opinions were now becoming more open and active. They organized marches for equality and began writing letters to local authorities asking for greater security and protection of human rights. But Edward, upon learning of these actions, decided to retaliate. He gathered his supporters and began organizing protests against Layla and her team, claiming that they were threatening the traditional values of the city. Layla knew that these protests could turn violent, and she decided that they needed to be prepared. With each passing day, the tension in the air grew. Layla knew that a serious test lay ahead, but with each step they took, she felt that they were moving in the right direction. Their fight for justice was just beginning, and Layla was ready to stand on the front lines, despite all the threats and dangers. When it came time for the trial, Layla felt the tension building. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath. Edward's arrest had captured the attention of local and even national media. The trial would not only examine his actions in kidnapping Layla, but also broader allegations of racist threats and violence. Layla, along with Gerald and her team, came to court with hope, but also with anxiety. She knew that there were supporters on the other side who might try to undermine the case. As she waited for the hearing to begin, she noticed some of them exchanging glances, their faces full of anger and hatred. The judge, an experienced woman named Mary, opened the hearing. "Today we hear the case against Edward, accused of kidnapping and threatening. We will hear both sides, and then the jury will make a decision," she said. Layla stood up when she was called to the witness stand. Her heart was pounding, but she was determined. She began to tell her story, describing how Edward had kidnapped her, the threats he had made, and the impact his actions had had on her life and the lives of her family. Her story was heartfelt, full of pain and fear, but also hope. She saw how some of the jury members listened to her with sympathy. She assured them that this was not only her story, but the story of an entire community suffering from prejudice and hatred. Then it was Edward's turn to defend himself. His lawyer tried to undermine Layla's testimony by making her look bad. He claimed that she was exaggerating to get attention. Layla felt her anger rising, but she tried not to give in to her emotions. "Your Honor, I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing this to stop his actions that are threatening many people," she said, her voice confident. After several days of hearings, it was time for the case to be closed. Layla sat anxiously in the courtroom, awaiting the verdict. Her thoughts were filled with how important it was that justice be served not only for her, but for all those who had suffered from bias. Finally, the judge returned with a decision. She looked at Edward, then at the room full of people waiting for an answer. "The jury finds Edward guilty of kidnapping and threatening. We call for a prison sentence and mandatory anti-bias training." The judge's words pierced the atmosphere. Layla felt the lump in her throat melt. She couldn't hold back tears of joy and relief, but at the same time, she knew that this decision was only the first step towards change. After the meeting, Layla walked out of the room feeling surrounded by the support of her friends and family. "We did it," she said, and the people around her began to applaud. Everyone in that moment knew they were part of something bigger. But despite the verdict, Layla knew the job wasn't over. Edward might be arrested, but his ideology, his followers, and the biases they were based on were still alive in the county. Layla was determined to keep fighting, to make sure the decision was a signal for change, and not just a temporary victory. Her dream of a just and equal society was just beginning to come true, and she was ready to move forward, regardless of any obstacles that might come her way. There was a commotion in the courtroom after Edward's verdict was announced. His face turned pale when he heard the judge's words about imprisonment. Edward couldn't believe that his life had changed so drastically. The judge gave him a sentence of 15 years, and he, not believing his ears, began to break through to his lawyer, but was stopped by the guards. Layla, sitting on the bench, felt the tension drain from her body. She looked at her father, who was squeezing her hand, and there was pride in his eyes. This was not only her achievement, but a victory for the entire community of which they were a part. A few days after the trial, Edward was transferred to the local jail. Behind bars, he found himself not only condemned, but also hated by those who supported him. Despair was written on his face. He had always considered himself the master of his fate, but now he found himself in a hopeless situation, locked in a dark cell, surrounded by criminals who had no sympathy for him. Layla knew that this was not just a punishment for him, but a lesson. She knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, and although she did not want to take revenge, deep down she felt satisfaction that justice had been served. In prison, Edward was confronted with a harsh reality. Many of the inmates were people who had also suffered from racism and prejudice, and Edward quickly realized that his former power and influence meant nothing behind bars. He was alone and hated, and his ideology found little support among those around him. Meanwhile, Layla and her team continued to work on projects to improve the situation in their community. They organized meetings, held educational workshops, and supported people who had also experienced discrimination. Her voice became more confident, and she felt that their actions were beginning to bear fruit. Layla and Gerald remained active in the city. They began working with local human rights organizations to create safe spaces for everyone, regardless of race. It was real work that took time and effort, but Layla felt she was on the right track. Even with Edward in custody, Layla knew his ideology could remain alive among his followers. She continued to work, understanding that true change required consistency and dedication. Layla dreamed of a future where hatred had no power and every human being was judged by their deeds, not the color of their skin. She understood that their fight was just beginning, and with every step they took they were getting closer to creating a more just and equal society. In the months following Edward's arrest, life in the area began to change. Layla and her team continued to work hard, inspiring others and bringing more people into their fight for justice. They organized numerous events to discuss the importance of equality and raise awareness of racial discrimination. With every step they took, the community became more united. Layla saw how people who had previously been silent began to actively express their opinions, share stories, and support each other. This was exactly what she wanted to achieve, to create a space where everyone could feel safe and respected. While Edward served his time in prison, his case became a symbol of change. The neighborhood began organizing roundtables to discuss how to confront hate and create a more inclusive society. Layla saw more people becoming aware of the importance of this movement, and her heart was filled with hope. One day, when she was preparing her speech at a meeting, she remembered everything she had gone through. The path had not been easy, but each step led to something greater. Layla realized that she was not alone in this struggle. People gathered around her, ready to support her and continue moving forward. As Layla took to the stage, her eyes lit up with determination. We are not here just to fight against hate, but to build a world where equality and respect are the norm. Let's make sure no heart is afraid to express itself anymore, she said, and the room filled with applause. By the end of the year, Edward had been transferred to another prison, and word began to spread about his attempts to reassert his influence among his supporters. But now Layla and her friends had a ready-made support network. They began working to create a rehabilitation program to show that even those who make mistakes can change if they receive the right support. Layla knew the fight wasn't over. Edward might have been physically removed, but his ideology still lingered among some of the city's residents. She and her team continued to work, knowing that every day was an opportunity to make the world a little better. Over time, when Layla looked back on the journey, she felt proud of what they had accomplished. Not only had they won this particular fight, but they had started a movement that could change the future. She dreamed of a world where racism and prejudice were a thing of the past, and instead there was understanding and respect. Layla's story became a symbol of hope and strength. It proved that every voice matters and that, united, any obstacle can be overcome. Ultimately, it was a story of love, struggle and the pursuit of justice that will live on in the hearts of people, inspiring future generations. Layla's story and her fight for justice ended on an inspiring note. Not only did she win her personal fight, but she was also able to unite people around the idea of equality and mutual assistance. They began a new era in their city, based on respect and understanding. With each new day, Layla became more and more confident in her powers and that they could change the world for the better. Her story became not just a symbol of struggle, but also an example of how important it is to defend your rights and the rights of others. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a chapter full of hope and opportunity for future generations. With this story, Layla knew they could rise to any challenge and change their community, and perhaps even the world. Thank you for following this story. We hope it has inspired you and made you think about the importance of fighting for justice and equality. We'd love to hear from you. What steps do you think can be taken to make the world a fairer place? Do you have any personal stories about fighting for human rights? Share your thoughts and comments below. Have a good day.